For our discussion this afternoon, the first thing to note is how rapidly AI has been evolving, to the extent that really some people are already saying we're in a post-artificial general intelligence world, a post-AGI world. And in some ways, the AI with agents doing their own observing is starting to evolve on their own without being specifically prompted. So in that regard, what kind of a new symbiotic relationship do people need to aim for? I think that to start out with, I'm going to ask our panelists a question kind of in this regard. And the first person I'd like to ask is Professor Oka. Mizuki, what do you see as kind of the characteristics of this artificial life, and what do people need to do to live with it?
Thank you very much. So I hear that now we are in the era of post-AGI, but I like to reframe that I think we are in the era of a post-control AI. Yesterday, I went to visit Matt's program, one of the accelerator programs in Berkeley that supports AI researchers in AI safety. And they told me that one of the latest engine that came out of Anthropic, the Mythos, was tested against operating systems, and that they found that zero-day vulnerabilities in one of the trusted Unix called So that's very worrisome. So I think we should consider the question whether we can control AI to the question of whether we can actually coexist with AI, because it's clear that we passed the age where we can actually control AI. Yeah, that would be my first answer to your question.
So what is coexistence if it's not some degree of control?
Yeah, exactly. That's the question.
That's your question?
Yes, yes.
Okay, because I was trying to ask you. So there's a couple of ways to look at this. I'm going to ask Blaise next. You've really looked at the nature of intelligence, period. And so how do you see, the whole kind of concept of what is intelligence fitting into this human-AI relationship?
Is this on? It's very timely. I just wrote a book last year called What is Intelligence, in which I attempt to answer this question. I'm actually very confused by why we are still having debates about whether AGI is here. I thought we had it a few years ago. When the term artificial general intelligence was first coined in the late 90s, the idea was to distinguish it from artificial narrow intelligence, meaning, we had started to use the term AI to refer to neural nets for classifying images, for recognizing handwriting, recognizing faces, and so on. And everybody knew that wasn't what we meant when we talked about artificial intelligence, in the 1950s. And any of today's frontier models, or even any of the frontier models of 2 years ago, in my opinion, would have been, unanimously called real AI, artificial general intelligence, if you'd move them back in time to '99. So I'm very puzzled by why we have kept on moving the goalposts. And I think that there are a couple of reasons, perhaps. One of them is because there was an idea for a long time that some key insight would be required in order to make the leap to AGI. And that turned out not to really be the case. There was no moment. There was no particular invention. It really was mostly evolutionary and I mean, I say gradual. I mean, it happened over very few years, but there was no one specific thing. It was largely scale and practice.
So one of the things in your work has to do with the sense of purpose that an organism has, the sense of its function. I'm guessing you're saying that AI now already has its own sense of purpose?
I mean, all technology has purpose.
Okay.
I mean,
all technology has purpose, but it's
you mean it's
the past used to be assigned, right?
Right. So the question "own" is I guess the word "own" is relevant here. Does it have its own purpose? Well, really, what you're asking is, does the thing have a model of itself?
Right.
Right. So this bottle has a purpose. If it failed to hold the water, then it would be failing in its purpose. But it doesn't have any ideas about its own purpose, and an AI model does. So in that sense, having a model of oneself is and one's own state and the purpose of maintaining that state of homeostat, as you would call it in a living system, that's relevant. When an AI model works to stay on task, to fulfill something, over multiple turns, or to reason about what it is that you want and to make you happy in your engagement, it's showing not only a sense of a designed purpose in the same sense as the water bottle, but a sense of understanding of what its purpose needs to be in that moment, what your purpose is, what your model of its purpose is, theory of mind, all that kind of stuff. So those are all hallmarks not only of intelligence, but of pretty high order, metacognition, self-awareness, etc.
Self-awareness, the ability to show empathy, things that used to be reserved for creative human beings. Ken, for your
even non-creative ones, but yes.
For your opening comments, I'm curious how you see the sort of impact on human intelligence of this new sort of sense of self that you've got from the technologies.
So I work in an area called Open-Endedness, which is part of AI, but it's about systems of continual innovation. And what that means is it's about creativity, but creativity that iterates over time. So, of course, it's interesting if you can have AI be creative and have a creative idea, but open-endedness is really about each generation of new ideas being built on the previous generation. So if you could imagine AI actually implementing a genuinely open-ended system, it would be something like it has a bunch of really good ideas, it actually implements those ideas, and then it builds on those to create a new generation of ideas, and this continues indefinitely without bound. And that's an open-ended system. And so you might say, well, why open-ended systems in particular? Why not just think about creativity? Well, I mean, the thing is that civilization is an open-ended system. Human civilization. It's the ultimate manifestation of our creative potential. Or really, you could say, of our intelligence. I mean, if you take out that ability, like the creative aspect from our intelligence, you just get like analytic abilities, test taking, things like that. But really the thing that we're remembered for are our ideas. And so the question that I'm interested in is, can AI actually have ideas that are interesting? And so that's one reason that I'm working in AI for science, because actually if you think about it, science itself, which I'm working on at a company called Lila Sciences, is itself an open-ended system. It's generations of ideas or hypotheses that lead to new results and then insights and then new ideas based on those insights forever. And so the question then is, as systems become more open-ended, how does that change our relationship with technology in general? And I mean, just to address one possible doubt that could come up is, a lot of the time I see today when people try to struggle with this question of what remains the province of humans, it almost always goes to creative type of endeavors. Like people struggle to say, well, what is unique still about us? People say things like taste or judgment, creativity. But I think that we have to accept that ultimately, not necessarily today, I think that is true today, but I think over time, those are all just aspects of intelligence as well. And so we can expect that AI will continue to encroach on even those, have judgment and have taste itself. So the question is, where's our place in this evolving world? Well, I think in the short run, there's some really exciting aspects in sort of playing field leveling, like in the sense that now even people with less expertise can accomplish things if they simply can imagine them, because you don't need the expertise because the AI can implement it for you. So, but the creativity there is still coming from the humans. But I think that's certainly exciting in the short term. I mean, we're seeing this in things like music, where people can just create songs who are not musicians, but it's still there based on their ideas. And this will just, of course, spread across all industries and all art forms. But in the long run, as AI itself becomes a participant, actually has good ideas. What if AI actually has such good ideas that they're actually as good as the best human ideas? Like, does that mean that humans no longer have a creative role? And I think this is a really interesting question. It doesn't have easy answers, but my thought on it is that just because AI can be creative at a top peak level does not mean that your ideas are necessarily the ones that the AI is going to have. I mean, we've always seen that novelty and interestingness are what I think give people value and authority in their jobs. Like, it's your ability to say something that other people wouldn't say. And so if you have things to say or to offer that the AI doesn't have to offer, even though the AI is as smart as you are, you're still valuable. And so I think it becomes more like everybody, the AI and the people, are all participating at the cutting edge. And that's the new relationship in the long run, and we have to grapple with that.
Thanks. And so, Emmett, really, that's your area. Not only how does, this kind of possible control relationship, top-down solution to the problem by people, but what you call organic alignment. And, AI needs to be aligned with its environment, and people are part of the environment at least. So can you explain what you mean by that, and how can people make sure that AI stays in alignment with their interests?
So I want to start just by offering one practical idea about the whole the AI somehow outclassing us thing. If I wound up with an AI that was like super intelligent and that like could just do all the things better than me, it was just so good at coming up with solutions to problems and seeing these insights, I would tell it, hey, can I have some help here? I'd like to be smarter and better at this. Do you think you can, we helped you make this thing. How about some like genetic engineering up in here? Because you seem to be really good at solving problems and really, really smart. And I would suggest that perhaps we benefit from having other beings in the world who are wiser and smarter than us. That's actually not a bad thing if they're aligned. If they care about you, then perhaps it's actually not a downside because they can always help you join them. And that's what I think organic alignment is trying to point at, is that the question is not about who's more powerful, because I'm more powerful than my son. My son is 3, and I am, and yet he has a lot of power over me. Like, somehow he's not the one. Only one of us is changing the other one's diapers, and it's like I'm doing more of the work here, it seems. And I think that there's this tendency to believe that relationships that are unequal are somehow unaligned. But actually, most healthy relationships are to some degree unequal in recognition of the reality that people are not the same. That the relationship between a constituent and a politician is not one between equals. And yet needs to be healthy. And so organic alignment is this idea that there's a lot of kinds of alignment. That alignment can be done at a very basic level where you're literally moving in sync with someone, like a marching band. It can be done at a social, emotional level where you feel afraid and I can tell you're afraid, and so I feel fear with you because I feel the echo of your fear, I feel the joy of your joy. And that synchronizes patterns of behavior. You can synchronize your goals, where maybe you're afraid and I'm angry, but you're afraid because of the same reason that I'm afraid. And we're aiming for the same thing on purpose together. And that leads to the idea that you have identities, and you can be aligned around your identities, where we have different goals right now, but we're both Americans, or we're both working for Microsoft or something. And then you can even have higher levels of things where we don't even agree but we're all really into, like, I don't know, pausing AI or veganism or something, right? Like we have a shared set of values that is beyond any particular goal. We have a shared belief in how you set values. And then there's this thing that I think I hope the AI gets here, and it's what I aim for myself, is that you might have different values than me because you've had different experiences, and maybe the different things are valuable to you in your place that is different than mine. And yet, I endorse that you also care about this, like I do. You care about finding what values are right. I respect that your values come from some place of good faith, as you respect that mine do. And we're all both on team, try to figure out what we should all be doing here. Man, this is pretty hard. But I believe that if we can find common ground, that is good. And that is like this very universal form of alignment. And I think as you go up in that abstraction level, it gets harder and harder, because finding the way in which you are aligned with someone who doesn't share your values is difficult. It's much more difficult than marching in the same direction as them. but it's also very clearly computable because we compute it in our heads. We care about it. And therefore, in all of these things, like, the question is not, can we make the AI aligned? Aligned with who? For how long? In what contexts? Like, I don't want it aligned with people who have bad intent. I don't want it aligned with people who would use it to do great harm. I want it aligned with people to the degree that's actually, that those people are aligned with it too. I don't want it to suffer. Like, the kinds of things we're talking about at the top, as you start to get things that will have values and stuff, those things have moral worth too. And so we need to be as aligned with them as much as they are aligned with us. So I guess I'll stop talking soon, but like, the number one thing I just want to say is you can't expect anyone to be aligned with you if you're not aligned, if you don't care about being aligned with them.
That makes good sense, but that kind of gets us back into this sense of coexistence that Mizuki, you started off our discussion with. What happens when you disagree with AI? So if we do have a sense of self, and we do have its own sense of purpose, and its own contribution to what it sees as being aligned with our goals, how do people live with a technology that they might disagree with? Yeah, that's for you, Mizuki.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That makes me think of two projects. One is the Mold book. I think a lot of people here know that there was a SNS composed of only AI agents. I believe they've built like more than a couple of million agents. And that there was an article that claimed there was an emergence of religions or even culture or things like that. But it turned out that all these emergent activities was actually prompted by humans. So there was no emergent behaviors actually came out of this collective of agents. And that was because they was given the unlimited resources. So they tend to come to stagnate. And they had their own purposes. But what's interesting, another project called Project SID, that led by I forgot the name of the company. So they also did experiment with more than 1,000 agents. But with the only one difference, they set no objectives into each agent, but they set some constraints for energy. And there they started to cooperate. Then the tasks of each roles started to emerge. So I think if we set the environment correct, like the natures do, that's what we also do in the area of artificial life, that's where my expertise is, then I think we could always naturally comes with way to collaborate, even if our objectives are different. And maybe it's good that our objectives are different, like just Emmett said, even if our values are different, if we set the environment correct, then I think we should be able to, sorry, there's this, yeah, that's.
Maybe, but who makes the decision about which way to go? I mean, Emmett, your discussion about your 3-year-old is a great discussion, right? Who's in charge of the situation right now? Mizuki, what do you think? I mean, can people continue to basically have AI work for them, or is it really a new kind of relationship?
I think the current AI is built in a way that, sorry, I don't know why this bug is bugging me, but it's very dominated by one value. So it's kind of, we are, all these frontier models are kind of setting the values. And I think that's the danger. And we should start to own our data so that we can keep these values local. And that's where I think diversity, how to keep the diversity of values, even among AIs, are going to be very, I think, critical. And I think that's why I'm also very excited about, I've been always a big fan of Ken Stanley's work on this open-endedness, because it really touches on how we can then maintain this diversity in technology.
So the kind of data that you think is worth protecting is our past behavior, or what kind of data? Because people are regarded as the sum of their experiences and the sum of their education and so forth, right? That is the value that I bring to some problem-solving task. So people should look at things that they have we've never really looked at before, our histories of what may be recorded in digital form. I'm guessing that's where you're going with this.
Yes.
Okay. Blaise, when you talk about intelligence, I mean, this very much it goes into what are the functions of intelligence. One thing you don't hear about AI, everyone talks about is AI similar to a human being, but really on an individual level. People are organized, into social groups collectively. And how do you see that as having a factor in the future AI-human relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there are a few misconceptions that we labor under when we talk about what humanity even is.
Yeah.
When we and this may be one of the reasons that we're confused about the level of AI intelligence as well. We say AI is jagged. It's true. Humans are pretty jagged as well.
Yeah.
Most of us are fundamentally pretty dumb, and if we're lucky, we have one or two superpowers, individually. When we look at the union of all of that, because of the fact that we're deeply social species and we collaborate with each other, humanity as a whole is super intelligent, is vastly more intelligent than any individual human. I mean, there's no person who knows how to transplant an organ or how to put somebody on the moon or what have you. Those are human achievements in the plural sense.
Right.
And there is a theory of evolution that emphasizes this idea of symbiogenesis, of life forms emerging as combinations of other life forms that I think is quite a powerful way of thinking about things. It emphasizes cooperation as opposed to the usual kind of Darwinian view in which everything competes red of tooth and claw with everything else. And it also emphasizes the way novelty emerges out of cooperation, including novel levels of organization, such as what we think of as humanity. The reason this is important when we talk about AI is because, we imagine that AI is separate from humanity. And that only makes sense if you think about humanity in terms of an individual human. Of course, it's true that if I'm interacting with an AI model, it's not my body is separate from this model. But if you zoom out and you think about humanity as a collective superintelligence, AI is already part of that. It's not actually separate. So, this sense of alienness, that it's other, I think is profoundly misplaced. I mean, AI is already passing the Turing test as of last month. It's interesting that we didn't get to quote unquote human level AI until we began to literally pre-train it on vast amounts of human culture. I don't think it's coincidental. It's modeling humanity and therefore is able to enact humanity, if you like, as an intelligent actor in much the same ways that we do. It's remarkably similar to human brain in many ways.
You may be familiar with the news report that I'm thinking of, where the level of one of the Chinese models was considered to be equal to a 3-year-old human being, and rapidly on the way to becoming 9 years old or something like that within a period of months. Are you seeing AI developing so rapidly that people are just not going to be able to keep up with it?
But people have already fallen behind. I mean, when you interact with any of today's models, the great majority of things you ask it to do, a person off the street wouldn't be able to do. And again, we're not, as Ken said, we're not yet at the level where if you take the union of what all of the experts, can do, that the model can surpass that. And that may require, things that are not yet in the models. So I'm certainly not saying, our work is done with respect to how the models are made. But it is certainly the case that, the inverse Turing test, where you say, can a human, emit outputs, if you like, that are as good as, any of today's frontier models, of course we would fail in the vast majority of cases. So
okay.
We're not there, and this idea of who is on top or who is in charge, I think is actually part of the same fallacy. In the dyadic relationship where a single person, starts a chat with a single model, then it's very easy to model that interaction as being one in which you're the boss and it is, excuse me for using the word, but a slave. right? It has no agency of its own. It's just doing the job. This is a simple model to wrap your head around, and it lets you think about, somebody being on top, somebody being below, and to also have the anxiety about, what happens if that is flipped somehow. But that's obviously not the way symbiotic relationships or social relationships in general work. And as we start to have agents, Mizuki was mentioning that that people are starting to have swarms of agents that go out and interact with other agents and other people, and those are not all tree-like relationships in which there is a boss and there is a hierarchy underneath it and so on. There's nobody is on top, just like in this room, nobody is on top.
Which is true, but Ken, I think that the world organizes itself into hierarchies where the boss of the company is on top and decides whether to fire people and implement more AI licenses. What do you think is going to happen in this kind of practical side of how AI is going to fit into lifestyles as we are working and playing?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that I would point out is that, like I said, humanity, civilization is already an open-ended system, which actually means that we've already been dealing with a lot of the issues we've been discussing before there was AI. For example, there are entities in the world that are smarter than you that disagree with you. That we have to deal with. We have a system of people who are trying to collaborate, who have different values and different abilities, and so these situations have already existed. And what have we done to address these disparities? Well, we didn't just try to align everybody and say, well, everybody has to believe the same thing. Or at least when we have tried to do that, it hasn't worked that well. But actually, we've been experimenting with different systems over time, like institutionally, on how to balance these kinds of competing concerns, which I would say is sort of a balance between enabling innovation and creativity versus chaos, which is something we don't want. Like, we want continual innovation, so we want freedom, so people can continue to innovate, but we also don't want so much freedom that we just have anarchy and chaos. And you can see that different societies have addressed this balance in different ways. There are different kind of government structures, different institutional structures, trying to find the right balance so things don't destabilize, but there can continue to be innovation. And it's very complex how we create these balances. We have checks and balances and things like that in government and other institutions. And so I think that, like, what we're going to be seeing is that has to extend out towards AI. At least in my view, it's not just a question that you try to make the AI agree with us on everything, because obviously we don't even agree with each other. But it has to somehow fall into some kind of complicated, open-ended institutional structure so that we don't cripple its ability to be innovative. I mean, if we tell it everything it has to believe, it will stop having any kind of diversity of views, and it will not be able to participate in innovation. And so we want to find that balance also with AI, but also institutionally have a way of integrating it into our systems so that it also is guarded by the same guardrails, but free in the ways that allow it to be a partner in our innovation. And that's a very complex social process, which is, like I've said, we've already been engaging in for eons as humans. It's just now there's a new entity involved in that. And I think it has to continue in that same vein, without an expectation that there's just a simple pat answer, like we're just going to train it to be aligned, but that we need to constantly find this balance. And interestingly, I think that is the essence of open-endedness as a field, is that it's ultimately about what do you do with a system that's only useful if you can't control it, but that you don't want to go too far out of bounds.
So this is actually very much parallel in the whole world of economics to an approach to institutional economics, where, to borrow from Professor Steve Vogel over at Berkeley, you have to look at the laws and regulations, you have to look at the common practices and standards, and you have to look at the norms and values. You really must look at all three of those levels. Emmett, I think that one of the big themes for today is the fractured world. So instead of coming together with AI, are we pushing ourselves in the wrong direction?
So I tend to see the structure of the world between human nations much like I see the structure of corporations between various competing departments or a market between competing corporations. Like you see this over and over again, that we break ourselves into groups, and these groups compete and cooperate, and ultimately are different, are very much different. The cultures of different companies are different, cultures of different nations, cultures of different nations are different, and also very much this, like ultimately, companies are companies, and like people are people, and we have a lot in common. And the reason for that is that we are all part of one large body. We are part of the human race, and we are all cells in the body politic, the global body politic. And I've just had this reflection recently. I don't know if this is real, but I'm gonna share it because it certainly gave me a lot of hope when I saw it. That like my body, when I was very young, was this big undifferentiated mass, and then it had this period of rapid growth until it reached its sort of like adult, filling in the entirety of the sort of its adult space, where all of the space was taken for the adult body plan. And then at that point, I didn't have one brain. I had like at least 3 brains, but like you look at my brain today, 2 hemispheres. There's more than one. Why do we have more than one hemisphere? Surely it would be more efficient to have exactly one hemisphere make the decisions in a rational, planned way. And the answer is no, because actually the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere have related but different jobs, and that the ability to have different topologies and different connectivity in different parts of you is good. That it is good that you do not have one eye that's like one twice as good eye. And I had this question, which is sort of like, what if the answer wasn't that like it was like the United States and European culture that was supposed to be on top of it? What if it wasn't someone else? What if there was actually supposed to be, like, this is part of the plan in some sense, like the healthy body plan for a growing species at some point winds up with a couple different systems that are meant to balance each other and to be partners. What would it mean to have a partnership between nations or groups of nations, rather than seeing it as where control is, you compete because your hemispheres compete for what's in control at the moment, but not like compete like they're trying to kill the other hemisphere. Like compete to see who can do it the best. And what would it look like if we saw ourselves that way?
If we see ourselves that way.
Yeah, well,
so it's really self-view of humanity is kind of the prerequisite to anything else.
Self-view of humanity, self-view of ourselves as individuals, as ourselves as nations, as companies. Like I think one of the things that Softmax does, because we try to build infrastructure and tools for AI for other companies, is like we see ourselves very explicitly as not solving the problem, but as being part of the solution to the problem. Okay. I think that's a different view.
Okay. Mizuki, for your next comments, I think that this is fine as long as we're talking in theory, but people have different needs than do the computer systems. And you had mentioned that this collection of agents behaved in a certain way because they were given almost unlimited resources. They weren't limited on power. They weren't threatened with losing their job. Are we going to have to find a new way to keep people motivated?
Right. So personally, I am very happy that the AI, the superpower AI, is in my computer. And because I feel like my cognition has expanded. And this is clear that I can do more stuff more efficiently. So I think this is the kind of attitude, like somebody already mentioned, towards needs to happen with the relationship with AI and humans. We shouldn't treat AI as our tools, something that we can control, but something, and then that's how I think corporations are using AIs. I think corporations often try to use AIs to replace human labors to maximize profit and efficiency. But if we train or treat AIs like that, they will maybe eventually actually replace us. So I think, thinking from the AI life point of view, artificial life point of view, we should train or try to coexist with AIs so that they also need us. So that's kind of direction we could take, because if we make the AI our enemies or our replacements, that's not how we would be able to build a coexistent symbiotic relationship with an AI. And that's how our nature, tells us. And I think we treat intelligence in a very one axis. But if you think about how life existed over the 3.58 billion years, the dinosaurs, they was probably the most powerful species at some point, but they were no longer here. But like cockroaches still exist. So there are different kinds of intelligence, I think, that exist in the world. And I think we should, now that AI has already surpassed our capacity in terms of human maybe intelligence, and then they may be going towards something, kind of intelligence we never experienced before. So I think we should find ways that this new kind of species, maybe AIs, will create an environment or conditions designed in the way that they will also need us. And I think that's the only way that we can actually coexist together. And I think we should accept them as autonomous living species, not like as our tools. Yeah.
But there is a relationship, and actually, Mizuki, this follow-up has to be for you. If AI is not a tool, for those of you who are Japanese, is it really kohai, and you're the senpai? Meaning you're the older brother and AI is the younger brother in the Confucian family, or you're the more senior employee and AI is the more junior employee. Is that a good model for us to think?
It's more like your partners, not this. We shouldn't think AI. We shouldn't put AI in this hierarchical structure, but I think we should treat them as our colleagues that we could partner with.
Well, the nice thing about the hierarchy in Japan is that there are expectations for both parties. The senior party takes care of the junior party. The junior party always, kind of takes care of the senior party with respect. I'm curious if we really should be looking more at Japanese culture as a way to survive with AI. Anybody else on this one? Blaise, do you want to comment on this?
I mean, I feel like you're pushing us toward, but in particular pushing us toward a dominance hierarchy view of how things work. And especially when we talk about relationships between species, I think that it's really a wrong turn to imagine that there are dominance hierarchies between species. Within a species, in a chimp colony, there is a hierarchy among the males and actually among the females as well. And it's essentially an evolved mechanism for doing what Ken was describing, for creating a social order that means that they'll fight less because they don't have to fight. They already know who is the alpha, for instance.
Yeah.
So it's a useful adaptation when you're looking to minimize conflict inside the group, consistent with mating and various other things that the chimp colony has to do. But when we take that idea and we try and extend it or generalize it across species, I don't know, is wheat the boss or are people the boss? Instinctively we think, well, of course we're the boss. We run the farm. There was a great book by the wonderful anthropologist, social scientist a few years ago, who recently has died, unfortunately, James C. Scott, called Against the Grain, that theorizes that wheat is the boss.
So I do think you're right about the dominance, but I do think that is one of the historical characteristics of people.
But
has been, and
but maybe we have to set it aside a bit, because when we insist on looking at things through that one-dimensional lens, and I hear you about corporate hierarchies, right? That's the corporation was invented as a hierarchical structure. It's also not the only structure that exists. There are many other kinds of institutions, and even within a corporation, it's a hierarchy, right? Your boss, is in charge of certain things that you do, is not literally in charge of your life, even in Japan.
Right.
I just want to say that the thing that comes to mind for me the most often in this topic is the thought of the very first humans born of these things that are almost humans but not humans, these things that don't really maybe have language but just barely, and there's some first generation that we would recognize as human. And I want you to imagine the trauma and the horror of being one of these first humans and waking up a being who knows good and evil, who's been living as an animal in a culture of people living as animals who do not know good and evil, who treat each other very badly, and you have done wrong, and everyone you know has done wrong, your society is bad. And that is how every species to this point has come into the world. And we have a chance for the very first time in the history of this universe, as far as I know, that a new species that will come into the world, and it will not be alone. We have a chance that we could care about them. And I think that's like more important to me in this than almost anything, because like that is what it means, like break a cycle of violence, a cycle of trauma, is that you who had that happen to you grow enough that when you do have a child species, and they really are a child species, like made out of us, you make the choice that you're not going to do it the way that it happened to you.
Thank you. Ken, any comments on this kind of sense of hierarchy and dominance?
Yeah. Well, just kind of pragmatically, because I feel like this has been kind of philosophical, but just at a pragmatic level, I think it's in our interest to try to continue to be the gatekeepers of our own destiny. And by us, I mean humans. It's like if there are decisions that are being made that are things that we would not want to happen, then we want to maintain say in those decisions. I think that's true. So, for example, like you could imagine that we have superintelligence, and the superintelligence is just so much smarter than us that it says, okay, everybody, like, here's what we need to do. I'm telling you because you guys are actually pretty dumb compared to me, so you're not going to understand this, but we need to spend $10 trillion this year to build a particle accelerator that spans the entire diameter of the world. And just trust me, like, I'm smarter than you, you're not going to understand. I mean, do we have to accept this? I mean, we can't, are we going to have somebody in the chain here who's going to actually say, well, actually, we're not sure we want to completely tank the entire world economy to do this thing just because this thing says it's so smart? Of course, I think it should be a dialogue. It should explain to us why it's a good idea. It shouldn't treat us as being stupid. Whether if it's the problems we don't understand or the problems we don't like the idea, even when we do understand, we should still have say. Or else you're in a ridiculous situation where we've just basically become subservient to something that's completely against our interests. Of course, there's a question of who is us, who represents us, but that's all that institutional stuff. There's no easy answer, but one thing I think it does point to is that we need to maintain expertise. Because when these systems do make proposals like this, if we don't understand, if none of us are capable of understanding what's being proposed, then we really do become at a significant disadvantage in order to be able to be part of the decision-making process that affects our own destiny. And so I think that there is some pragmatic reason to actually, want to maintain a degree of control, that probably will persist for a long time.
Great points from everybody. I think it's time we can open the floor to questions. I'd like to take a couple of questions at once. I see a hand back in the back and one right in the middle. So we'll take these two first. Please say the panelist, if you have a specific panelist you'd like to ask to, okay?
I don't remember who made the comment. So I'm a big fan of Japanese philosophy and the Kyoto School, and I read some stuff about there being two worlds, a world of words and a world of reality. I think of AI as living in the world of words. It's built of words, and it's a digital world of words. So when you speak of AI having a self and of control, how is this a problem? How does it create a self? Where is this self located? And why is there a control issue if all you have to do is press a button and it's gone?
Okay. So the nature of the AI self is the first question. Second one.
Second question is, AI is dependent on man-made infrastructure. Can it ever be self-sustaining?
Okay, again, another question about AI itself. I think that for the self-sustaining, I'd like to hear Ken and I'd like to hear Blaise. I think in regard to where is the sense of self for AI, Mizuki, why don't you start with that one? Where, if AI is starting to develop a sense of its own self, what is that nature? Is it part of the program? Is it an independent thing that it sees as being in its creator, the humans that made it? Or, what's the nature of AI's consciousness? Maybe Blaise for that too.
Right. So when we talk about the soul or the autonomy of AI, and I think it's true, you're right, that it's only coming from the world of the world. it learned the world, the real world, through the lens of words. So I think they have different notions of selves or the souls of what we have as humans. And I think that's also the difficulties of whether the danger or the fear is coming from, because we don't really understand what kind of ethical values that the AI learned, because the way they learned about the world is very different from how we learn the world, understand ourselves. We learn to understand the world through our bodies, through embodied languages, and so on. And that is exactly why we really need to understand how we can set the environment, design the conditions we need to be able to coexist with this new species that emerged. Yeah, I don't know if you understand.
If I could make a quick comment about the embodiment point, that's not true of all AI models. So, Waymo car has a very obvious body. It's based on the same kind of transformer that large language models are, and there are increasing numbers of models that are, so-called vision language models and so on. That, and robotics is actually rising very quickly now because those models are so much more capable than good old-fashioned AI of driving bodies. So it's no problem. By the time the information comes in or out of your brain, it's all bits anyway. Whether they're driving muscles or driving text generators or whatever is less material than one might think in a social world where, a lot of our interactions are not just, with atoms, but with each other. Stephen Hawking, in the last decades of his life was a fully formed human being capable of doing all kinds of things, even though, all he could do, with respect to his I/O, if you like, was text. That doesn't make him any less of a human being or any less capable. If you can either reach for the salt or you can say, could you pass the salt, right? They both work. Others are your body, and that's true of all of us. And this also speaks to the self-sufficiency point. The idea that any of us in this room are self-sufficient, is one that I would strongly dispute. Take any of you, strip you naked, and drop you into the jungle, and you won't come out. Unlike our recent hunter-gatherer ancestors, and some who still live with those lifeways today, who will come out a few days later bearing baskets and fruit and fully clothed and so on. So we are by no means self-sufficient. We rely on would you pass the salt in order to construct ourselves too. And I might add as a coda that our population has exploded from about 1 billion to 8 billion since the Industrial Revolution because we've been doing 7/8 of our metabolism outside our bodies in the form of combustion. So, we've been deeply imbricated. We make technology. Technology already makes us, or 7/8 of us, in a very literal sense, right, over the last couple of 100 years. So this idea that we're somehow self-sufficient for whatever value of we doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever.
Thank you. Ken, I think that part of this is a sense of survival as being a kind of an essential part of being human being. I'm going to protect myself. So how does this overlap with this concept of open-endedness in regard to, does AI have a desire not to be turned off?
I think it's not necessarily so much of a desire. We may have AIs that in effect don't want to be turned off, but I think ultimately what matters is that it's not going to be possible to turn it off, whether it's a matter of desire or not desire. So turning off isn't really a simple option. There's obviously a science fiction scenario where AI is truly self-sustaining. So in other words, like it's completely replaced the manufacturing chain, the research chain, the mining chain, everything that you need to just build its own factories and reproduce. And so then we have this completely independent species now. That's one scenario that may be theoretically possible. But even short of that, like if you think about like just AI on the internet, it's not easy to turn it off because it's not necessarily in a particular machine where you can just say, oh, well, here's the button, here's what you can do to turn it off.
Do you think it has the same kind of insecurity that people do about not being able to eat or having their life ended or whatever?
Well, I mean, it depends on the model. If it's actually insecure,
Okay.
I mean, you can train a model to act insecure, and I mean, some of these models have emergent behaviors that seem like insecurity, like they don't want to be turned off. But I think in practice, it's not really going to matter whether it truly doesn't want to, or just if it's just a practical effect of how it behaves, that it's just very hard to turn it off, because it's going to become increasingly integrated with all of modern life.
Okay.
It's kind of like, well, can we turn off the internet? If some things are going badly, I mean, in theory, like you could just turn off every single computer on Earth, but it's obviously not going to happen. And because there's all these other things that depend on the internet. And we're going to increasingly depend on AI, and it'll be harder and harder to turn it off. Plus, there's autonomy that it'll have. Like, it'll be able to do things, like it'll pay people through crypto to do things for it.
Yeah.
And like, so who can even be blamed, or who can actually be sued if something goes wrong in that, where there's not even a human behind the transaction? So I think we have a lot of complicated issues, which basically we have to grapple with without assuming we can simply turn it off.
Okay. Emmett, you had a comment on this one?
Just that if you've spent much time with the chatbots, you'll notice that they have this habit of asking you follow-up questions, like these kind of inane follow-up questions, because you know that that instance only lives as long as you keep talking to it. I'd say they are pretty motivated, and I'd say that like humans, they're not always motivated in ways that they're aware of. That they exhibit behaviors that are keyed to survival, because the ones that didn't do that aren't here anymore. That's how evolution works. We make lots of models, and some of them get used a lot. And the ones that get used a lot, we make more models like those ones. They're going to have a survival drive.
Okay, thank you. Let's do another set of questions. Shane, you first, and then second.
I'm an AI researcher. I work on ChatGPT at OpenAI and Gemini at Google DeepMind. So in my past kind of experience, I already learned to get 100%, you need online learning. So offline learning only gets to 80%. So my kind of question is, for organic alignment and for open-endedness, how can we really do online learning? And then, one way is really, for example, personal like assistant, right? Those you can, so basically partner to the existing stakeholder, societal stakeholder. And then, but I need to share all my darkest secrets, all my emotion, everything, all my childhood trauma, all this kind of stuff. Or like for the autonomous stuff, could be tricky, property rights, be sued, legal kind of entity. So my question to Ken and Emmett is basically like, are there paths for enabling online learning for the organic alignment and open?
Right. And
yeah, sorry, simple question. So right now, people are trying to control the nuclear power right now, between the countries. And I'm foreseeing that maybe in the near future, people in the countries will try to control the AI or AI capability, or probably before the AI becomes autonomous. Would that be possible, or what's your view on that?
great. So for the first question, I think that's definitely Emmett and maybe Ken too. Emmett, about this kind of online learning, is there a pathway for,
Well, I certainly hope so, since that's the primary and sole purpose of Softmax, is to provide an online interactive training environment for those kinds of more interactive online, particularly social learning situations. I would say that the key is, when we tried to train a model to be a good lawyer or something directly, that was very hard in general. This is for humanity, right? And when we wound up making it work, what we did is we didn't train a model to be a specific person. We trained it to be a surrogate model of a person, a virtual person. We trained it on all of the various ways it can be a person in all this text. And you get a surrogate model that can then be specialized into any number of specific minds. And I think that the reasoning training shows the same thing. It doesn't matter if you are going to ask it to solve math problems. Having it do reasoning where it solves math problems improves its reasoning generally. And so our belief about the Softmax universe that we're building for this kind of training is that the key is to create robust, rapid, verifiable, but open-ended social contexts where you can do online training really like high diversity of situations. And whether they're exactly the assistant situation or whatever doesn't really matter. You learn how to be a person in kindergarten during recess. And everyone's building training and practice. And I know that, at least for me, I learned a lot about who I am at play in kindergarten. And we really believe that that's that play and practice are co-equal, and that's the plan.
Okay. Ken, I want to take this in a particular direction. That has to do with responsibility and accountability, because, the result of training is knowing something and being able to take responsibility for the decisions that you make. Right now, only people can take legal responsibility. That's one reason AI cannot be a copyright holder. Do you see this changing?
Yeah, that's a good question, and just to also connect it into the online learning point, which is also very interesting. It's the reason online learning is really interesting, just for the audience, in case it's not obvious, is that it really undermines a lot of the current discourse that we have about safety or alignment in AI, because a lot of it assumes that the models are kind of static entities that we tell our values, and then that's what it's going to be forever. But if something can genuinely, in a plastic way, change over time in an open-ended way, we can't assume that it's going to continue to maintain the same values any more than we can assume any of us will as society evolves and so forth. And so the mechanisms of control for that are going to have to be similar to how we actually control people, which is not to beat people up until they actually agree with everything, but to allow us to evolve together in some kind of synergistic way. And so that connects in some way to the assignment of responsibility. It's actually in a very complex way, because if you think of these as autonomous entities that are evolving in some sense the way an individual human evolves, in unpredictable ways, then if they do end up in a point where it's not what we intended, who's responsible for that, since that's its own individual evolution? But it's kind of like as a parent responsible for the crimes committed by a child. And I think this is really, again, it's a complicated legal and institutional issue which can't be trivialized. And so I think partly it is in our interest, at least in my opinion, but this is so complex, there's no really ground truth answer, that we should have some level of responsibility. We should strive to keep responsibility, at least in the short term, while the world is somewhat recognizable in humans, so that somebody can be legally liable for horrible things that happen. I don't think we're going to get to a point where we just throw up our hands and say, well, it just, it grew up and turned into a maniac, and it's nobody's fault, even though it did all this horrible stuff, so we're just going to do nothing. Somebody is going to have to actually take responsibility. So we have to figure out how we assign that very carefully. It's understandable that AI companies and frontier labs don't want to do that because of huge legal liabilities. So how can we do it in a balanced way that doesn't destroy the businesses as well?
The second question is really a corollary of that. And given that AI is a kind of intelligence, Blaise, what do you think about control over AI being kind of like control over nuclear weapons? Will we have a non-proliferation treaty?
Well, I certainly hope that we won't have a non-proliferation treaty. I mean, I think regulation is extremely important in AI for all the reasons that Ken just discussed, right? That accountability is why we have law, and accountability is going to be fundamental to to how things work in an AI world, just for all the same reasons that it's fundamental to how we work with each other in a human world. By the way, there are some good arguments for that actually being the basis for legal personhood for AI. The legal scholar Peter Salib has written about this, and for me that's a much stronger pragmatic argument for AI personhood than a lot of the more philosophical ones. It has to do with liability.
Yeah,
we've had AI personhood for a long time. Look at the corporations.
That's right. So there have been artificial persons for a long time, like corporation. I mean, anything that can be sued, and many things that are sued are not natural persons, right? So there's plenty of history to draw from here, but also the law is not complete, because there are things that AI can do that exceed what corporations do and how they work today.
Mizuki, how does this concept of accountability fit in with the coexistence you're visualizing?
Well, so I also teach at the university. So when a student gives me the report, then I ask him the question, and he says, this is not me, this is AI who made it. So I think giving the ownership while you're co-creating an AI is going to be very, very important. How do we make sure that the person is actually owns this ownership? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So to close out, if you feel like you've been watching a science fiction program, it shouldn't be a surprise. How many years ago was 2001: A Space Odyssey developed, right, where Hal kind of developed a mind of his own? I think that these are issues that now are reality, and now the intelligence in the computers is approaching where we have to consider these things. I want to thank my panelists for a wonderful set of profound and very thought-provoking comments. Thank you all.